Hey everybody, Cody Menz here, doing a review for the new Tier 8 British premium tank destroyer, the Turtle Mk.1. As its name suggests, it's a pretty slow, somewhat heavily armored British tank destroyer, and it's a kind of a predecessor to the Tortoise, if I'm not mistaken, that most people know at Tier 9. What's the video about here? Pretty much, is it worth buying? Is it a good tank? And, generally, how does it kind of play? So getting into some stats here, first I'm going to be comparing this to the AT-15, also the AT-15 with the 32 pounder, so the 20 pounder and 32 pounder, and then the TS5, kind of the closest tanks I found to the Turtle Mk.1 here. Starting with the firepower, the gun, 330 damage, 224 millimeters of penetration, 253 on the premium, and pretty high DPM, low over 3100 with just 100% crew and nothing else added to it. The gun's awesome on this thing. It's got pretty much the highest DPM I could find for a Tier 8 tank destroyer, barring the ISU 130 shooting premium shells that do more damage but less pen. The DPM's crazy on this thing. 330 damage is a little bit low for a Tier 8 TD, generally speaking, like lower than a TS5 here, higher than the AT-15 in both of these gun options. Most people use a 20 pounder, but I included the 32 pounder since some people use that sometimes as well. But the AT-15 is pretty much one of the lowest damage per shot tanks, and having the DPM and also the 330 damage, it feels nice. You don't feel that low DPM even though you are well below the norm. TS5's more normal, around 400 damage per shot for Tier 8 TD, and even that's kind of low compared to some. But the gun on this thing is freaking awesome. The penetration's a little bit low. Do keep in mind this thing will not be able to fight, say, heavily armored targets very well. Your penetration will struggle against Tier 9s. Tier 10s, it's actually a pretty big weakness, especially given your somewhat slow speed that we'll get into. Much like the AT-15, this thing is going to chew apart lightly armored targets, mediums. If you can hit weak spots, you're going to be doing a lot of damage, but do note against higher tiers and armored targets, this thing will struggle quite a bit like its tech tree counterpart. Getting into some more gun stats here, really quick aim time, really good accuracy, great gun depression, and better gun elevation than the AT-15 here. And compared to the TS5, this thing is super accurate. Also, the gun depression is double the TS5's. Now, this tank, the gun depression is very important on this. Going to get into that with the armor scheme. And combined with the gun, you're a excellent ridge fighter, as you can kind of see here. Kind of holding my own here against the two tanks. And while the accuracy is worse than the AT-15 for both of those gun options, the 20 pounder being the one that most people select, .33 is still a really good value for just 100% crew with no equipment or anything else in it. And the aiming time, being lightning fast, is nice. On the move accuracy doesn't feel bad as well. Like you can kind of zoom around at your blazing fast top speed, and you can still hit things pretty consistently. Only when you're moving the hole like left and right does it get like a little bit inaccurate, but it aims in super fast, so it's not that big of a downside. Getting to some mobility stats here. Top speeds, forward and backwards, same as the AT-15, 20 kilometers forward, 10 in reverse. Slower than, say, the TS5, however, by a considerable amount there. Specific power is higher than the AT-15's, and the gun traverse is, lower. Hull traverse is higher. I did notice, playing this, that you actually struggled sometimes on a very small incline. If not, it looked like level ground to me at hitting your top 20 kilometer an hour top speed. It seems like the terrain resistance on this tank might be a little bit poor. So do note that sometimes you're kind of capping out at 19 and not 20, which was a little strange to me. And going uphill, you're not going to be hitting 20 at all. It's going to be about like 16 kilometers an hour, 15. I noticed on a regular basis, even when like hitting, say, a small hill, say like this, at top speed, you're going to lose speed pretty quickly. Much like the AT-15, but keeping in mind that this thing's slow, and your specific power is just low enough, and your terrain resistance don't seem all that. So might feel a little slower sometimes. However, that whole traverse is pretty nice. You know, being lower than the TS5s, that already has a pretty good value. It's a little hard to flank this thing, as these people kind of found out here, as they kind of threw themselves at me. In any event, though, mobility is definitely towards the lower side of tier 8 TDs. Keep that in mind. Shouldn't be as a surprise, though, given that there's literally turtle in the name of this tank. Moving on to HP and also the V range. Your HP 1400, a little bit low for a tier 8 TD, but you know, not the worst. But compared to some other armored TDs, say like the TS5 here, even the AT15, you have a little bit lower HP as them. So it kind of balances it out in a way. You know, in the general play style of this tank, it's a really good ridge fighter with that gun depression, the fast firing gun, really good accuracy, so you can kind of play like mid range. As you can see me playing here, you don't really want to get up too close here in this tank. Like I'll go into the armor after the clips here in the garage. The armor's not as solid as the AT-15s all around, generally in a brawling situation. And also your V range is pretty standard for a tier 8 tank destroyer. 370 millimeters, 370 meters. Once you put optics in it, it's nearly max, and that's before, you know, you have any crew skills and stuff like that, which you can hit the max V range with them. But generally speaking, you know, the V range on this thing, being a TD, isn't exactly a deal breaker. Now, going toe to toe against the AT-15 with the 20 pounder, kind of lining them up here. At first, like, you want to say that the higher damage per shot, you know, than say the 20 pounder. I chose that gun since that's the top gun that I feel like the majority of people pick. At first, you feel like the DPM and damage per shot just completely blow the AT-15 20 pounder out of the water, but then you kind of see it has a little bit better accuracy. Also, when it comes to, you know, you have a little bit more health and a little bit more penetration. It's like those little key things, they don't seem like they matter too much. The main thing that I haven't gotten to yet is specifically the armor and the general playstyle. I feel like both tanks kind of have their place, where the AT-15, you're gonna, you know, need to hit more shots to do as much damage, plus your DPM's lower. However, generally speaking, the Turtle Mk.1 is a tank where it performs pretty well long ranges at kind of bouncing things, much like the AT-15. However, you're really going to struggle if you're on level ground, especially near tanks, given the differences in the lower glacis of this tank as far as the armor, the general like shape of the armor as well, and also the sides. The sides seem a little bit weaker, and especially the rear seems weaker than the AT-15, just generally speaking. And once you start getting shot by higher tier tanks, you know, I feel like the Turtle Mk.1, unless you're hull down, is going to be easier to pen just because it's pretty much just one flat. You know, it is angled, but basically one sheet of armor on the front, and you're going to get chewed apart by, say, tier 9 tanks, tier 10s, whereas the AT-15 has some curved armor, and you might get a little bit lucky, especially if you angle a little bit more. So anyway, is this tank great? I really liked it. Like, I've played several battles in it, and it feels familiar enough to where if you like the, you know, British tank destroyer line leading up to the Badger, you're gonna love this tank. The main issues, you know, obviously are the speed, sometimes with the armor close up, and the low damage per shot. I almost, at first I wanted to include it, but I don't think it's that much of a downside because the DPM just kind of covers that up. Do note, one thing you might have seen in some of these clips, the ammo rack on this thing is extremely weak. The engine is also extremely weak as well, to where you're going to get ammo racked, and also your engine's going to get damaged quite a bit if you get shot in the sides whatsoever, or the rear whatsoever. In the first, I think it was like the first 3 games that I played in this thing, I had that happen to me every single match in the shots that I got shot in the side and the rear. One thing to note, a lot of TDs have that, but not all of them, so just keep that in mind. One other little tidbit before we get into the armor here, the shells on this thing do cost like a little bit more. If you kind of glance at that, and getting into that here, basically the ammo on this thing is higher than AT-15s, but it does do more damage per shot. You got to keep that in mind. The premium shells, kind of doing a little bit of math, they are pretty expensive to use if you do lean into them, which that low, 224 millimeters of pen, you might need some more APCR than you might be comfortable throwing sometimes if you're against tier 9s and 10s. Keep that in mind, where that might impact a little bit of credit earning. So what I've been talking about quite a bit here is the armor. While I beat up on the armor a little bit, I really like it in some ways. So negative 10 degrees of gun depression is pretty darn awesome. Really, so getting into kind of the armor scheme here, you have a cupola, however it's super tiny. I was only shot like once in this thing across well over 100 shots getting thrown at this tank so far. And this thing's really tiny. It is somewhat weak, keep that in mind. However, once you start hull down, in this tank with the 10 degrees of gun depression, it's pretty much impossible to hit. It sits a little bit towards the center of the tank, which is nice. However, so compared to the AT-15, I'll show you that armor scheme as well. This thing's pretty decent armor-wise against tier 8s and, under. However, as you can see as you get down further on the hull, it gets pretty weak, and then the lower glacis drops below that 200 millimeters effective armor. So if you're out brawling in this thing, compared to the AT-15, you're going to get penetrated quite a bit. And this tank, as you can see, the armor is mostly located towards the top of the tank, and around the mantlet is pretty darn awesome, kind of the expected of a British TD like this. But you really don't want to get hit beneath your gun, and especially the lower glacis. I was getting penned a lot, specifically like a WZ-111 penned me in my lower plate at first, and I was like, holy crap, it wasn't even shooting premium. And yeah, that really drove that home. The sides, I think that they're roughly the same as the AT-15, but they're really flat. There's a little bit of space armor here too, but generally speaking, you're definitely weaker on the rear than the AT-15. But comparing it to this armor really fast here, generally speaking, the AT-15 has a larger cupola. It's also weaker, but you have a lot more armor areas, especially lower down, and there isn't really a lower glacis on this thing, where I feel like this thing's the better brawler. And when you're playing the Turtle Mk.1, you're definitely going to want to hold down a lot. So this is more of a hold down mid-range fighter. AT-15 you can play mid-range, but it's also the better brawler than the Turtle Mk.1, even with the lower damage per shot, also the lower DPM. So at the end of the day, like, this tank, it's hard to beat up on it because it's pretty much just a slightly different take on the AT-15, much like how the TS5 is a slightly different take on the T28. They both have very good similarities between, those two tanks and also these two tanks over here. And especially with the armor, where the Turtle's armor's better higher up, while I feel like the AT-15 armor is better lower down on the tank. One thing to remember too with the crew here, it does work, say, across like the AT-15. Once you get into looking at some other crews though, like, it'll line up with the Tortoise. It doesn't line up, with the other line, like the Conway FV4005 Stage 2. With the Badger, it does line up with the Badger, which is nice. So really, you're getting a crew trainer, for this line. And once you start dropping down to like the AT-7, it works with that. So it does have that really good crew training aspect. So personally, like, is this tank worth it to buy? I personally like tanks like this. It's got the armor, especially, when you're hull down. It does struggle against higher tiers. That's the main downside outside of the slow speed. And, just do note this thing is slow, to where you do have a great gun. Your armor's workable when you're using it, especially hull down. But fighting against tier 9s and 10s, I didn't do too much of that so far in these battles. Matchmaking was a little kind with me. You are going to have to be careful, because having played the AT-15 quite a bit, You know, you're not going to be able to penetrate quite a lot of things sometimes against armored targets. Your HE round, I didn't go too much into that, but your HE round's not too bad in this. 430 damage, 54 pen. They're changing HE rounds, you know, at least trying to on sandbox, so you know, we'll see, but the HE round's not too bad. At the very least, it's going to have a decent one. And like overall, like if you like tanks like this, you know, pick it up. It's a great tank. A lot of people I feel like are going to just call this overpowered. It completely outclasses the AT-15 in so many ways. I think it's probably slightly better than the AT-15 because of the damage per shot. Also the DPM, but I don't think it just completely outclasses it because it does have those couple downsides as I mentioned. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. Hopefully this helps you kind of, you know, inform me a little bit on whether to pick this tank up or not. And yeah, if not, then at least you know how to kill it a little bit easier. And thanks for watching. Have a good one.